On a frost-bright morning in October of 1858, in the trampled dooryard behind Judson Pryor's store in the mining camp of Magpie Gulch, Hallie Winslow raised her hand into the cold and paid 50 cents, every last cent she had meant to spend that day, for a cracked stoneware crock that the auctioneer would not even promise held anything worth having inside it. The whole yard broke into laughter, and no one laughed louder or longer than Rance Colvin, who cooked the only hot food for sale in camp, besides Hallie's own boarding tent, and who had spent the last 10 minutes telling anyone who'd listen that the crock was nothing but a dead man's spoiled paste, sealed up in a jar too ugly to sell for a nickel. Hallie did not flinch. She counted the coins into the auctioneer's palm one at a time, the way she counted everything in her life, took the scrap of paper that made the crock legally hers, and carried it back through a yard of grinning, red-faced men toward the mule she'd borrowed to haul it home, holding that cracked jar against her hip the way another woman might have carried something precious. What none of them understood, not Colvin, not the freighters slapping their knees, not even the auctioneer himself, still chuckling as he moved on to the next lot, was that Hallie had knelt in the frozen dirt beside that crock a full 10 minutes before she ever raised her hand, working the wax-sealed lid half loose with a borrowed knife, and had put her face close enough to the crack in its side to catch a smell that was not the smell of anything rotten at all. She already knew something the rest of Magpie Gulch did not know yet. It would be the better part of a season before they found it out. If you like a story where a debt and a dead man's leftover jar somehow end up on the same side of the ledger, stay through this one with me, because there are a great many numbers still to come, and not one of them is going to land where the men laughing in that yard expected. Tap the like button before we go further, and tell me down in the comments what state or country you're listening from tonight, because I do read every one of them. Now let's go back to the beginning of that October morning, because 50 cents was only the second strangest thing Hallie Winslow did in that dooryard, and to understand the first, you need to understand exactly what a camp like Magpie Gulch was starving for. Hallie was not yet 30, and she had run the boarding tent at the lower bend of the Magpie Gulch Freight Road for the better part of 14 months, ever since her father, Ezekiel Winslow, had followed a rumor of color up from the Sacramento Valley with his daughter beside him, and died there the following January, buried under 6 feet of rock slide at a claim called the Perseverance, that had never once, in the whole time he worked it, lived up to its name. Hallie had stayed. She told herself at first it was only until she'd earned enough to go somewhere with an actual future in it, and then a year had gone by, and the boarding tent had become, in the plain, unglamorous way most permanent things become permanent. Simply her life. Magpie Gulch itself amounted to perhaps 60 men in a good season, and fewer once the cold thinned the placer claims down to whoever couldn't afford to winter anywhere better provisioned. A quarter-mile of rutted road strung along the creek bottom, Pryor's store at its center, a pole corral livery, a saloon tent that did steady business in every season, regardless of what else in camp went quiet, and Hallie's own boarding tent at the lower bend, where the road widened enough for a loaded wagon to turn around. Above camp, the gulch narrowed and climbed toward the diggings themselves, and above that, a full 2 days' hard travel up a grade that iced solid every winter, sat Ruby Bar, a smaller camp still, supplied by the same road and considerably more alone on it than Magpie Gulch had ever been. She knew most of camp by name within her first month there, the way a woman running the only eating house on a stretch of road inevitably comes to know everyone who passes through it, which men paid promptly and which needed reminding, which freighters preferred their coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and which liked it weak, which of the placer miners up the gulch was likely to strike color that season, and which had already, though he hadn't said so plainly to anyone, begun quietly planning his trip back east before the next winter caught him short. It was not friendship, exactly, most of it. It was something closer to the particular intimacy that comes from feeding people regularly, watching them at their most tired and their most hopeful both, across the same rough plank table day after day. Her days ran the same shape most mornings, whatever the season. She rose before the freighters did, built up the cook fire, set beans to soak or coffee to boil, depending on what the larder held, and had breakfast ready by the time the first wagons stirred at the corral. She fed whoever came through at midday, fed them again at dusk, kept a rough tally in her head of who owed what, and settled it honestly at week's end, and fell into her own cot most nights too tired to do more than run the day's small numbers once through her mind before sleep took her. It was not, she would have said if anyone had asked her plainly, a hard life exactly. It was simply a life with very little room in it for anything beyond the next meal and the next payment. And she had learned, in 14 months of living it, to find what satisfaction she could inside those narrow margins rather than mourning the wider ones she'd once imagined for herself. She thought of her father more often than she let herself say aloud. Ezekiel Winslow had been a hopeful man rather than a lucky one, the kind who read a rumor of color in a Sacramento newspaper and heard, underneath it, a whole different life waiting to be claimed rather than the considerably more likely disappointment most such rumors delivered. He had sold their small share of a Missouri farm for enough to outfit a wagon and buy passage west, and Hallie, 26 that spring and with no particular reason to stay behind alone, had gone with him because the alternative, watching him go without her, had seemed at the time a good deal harder to bear than the journey itself. He had worked the perseverance claim through that first summer with the same steady, undiscourageable hope he'd carried across 2,000 miles of trail, and the rock slide that killed him in January had come. The men who found him agreed afterward, quickly enough that he likely never understood what was happening at all. Small mercy, and the only one Hallie had allowed herself to take from the whole business. She had buried him on a rise above the claim rather than in the camp's own scattered burial ground below, wanting him somewhere he could go on looking at the horizon he'd crossed 2,000 miles to reach, and had stood at that grave a single afternoon before deciding against going home to Missouri with nothing to show for the trip but a debt and a grief. She pitched her tent at the bend in the Magpie Gulch road within the month, because feeding hungry freighters was, at the least, work she already knew how to do. The tent itself stood at the widest bend of the road, a long canvas structure over a plank floor with 2 trestle tables, a sleeping loft she rented out by the night to freighters caught by weather, and a cook fire pit out back where she turned salt pork and beans and coffee into the only hot meal most men passing through Magpie Gulch could count on getting. It was honest work, and it paid honest money, $6 to $9 some weeks during the fall freighting season, nearly nothing in the dead of winter when the road iced over and no wagons came through at all. What it had never once produced, in 14 months of Hallie standing over that cook fire, was real bread. This was not for lack of trying. Magpie Gulch sat the better part of 110 miles from the nearest town with a store that stocked fresh yeast cakes, and yeast cakes, even when a freighter remembered to carry them, did not survive that road. They spoiled in the heat of September, froze dead in the cold of December, and arrived, on the rare occasion they arrived at all, crumbled to a gray paste that raised nothing but a cook's temper. What Magpie Gulch ate instead, every camp up and down that stretch of the Sierra ate the same way. Flat cakes mixed quick with flour and water and fried in grease, or, when a man had saleratus on hand and something sour enough to work against it, a cup of buttermilk, a splash of vinegar, a heavy, faintly bitter loaf that rose only halfway and tasted, Hallie privately thought, like a compromise nobody was satisfied with. Rance Colvin sold exactly this kind of bread from a plank counter 20 yards up the road from Hallie's own tent, alongside flapjacks fried thin and tough as harness leather, and he sold a great deal of it, because for 14 months it had been the only bread in Magpie Gulch, and a hungry man did not have the luxury of comparing it to anything better. Hallie had a private opinion about Colvin's bread that she had never once said aloud in his hearing, mostly because a woman running a tent alone on a freight road learned early which opinions were worth the trouble of voicing. But she remembered the way a person remembers the taste of a particular afternoon, real bread, the kind her own mother, Ruth Ann Winslow, had baked every week of Hallie's childhood back on their few acres outside a small Missouri crossroads, using a covered crock that sat warm behind the kitchen stove and never once, in all the years Hallie could remember, ran empty or needed a peddler's yeast cake to work. Her mother had called it, without much ceremony, simply the start, fed it flour and water the way another woman fed chickens, and produced from it, every single week, loaves with a crust that crackled when you broke it, and a sharp, clean sourness underneath the wheat that Hallie had not tasted once, not from a single loaf, in the whole 14 months since she'd left Missouri behind. Her mother had died the spring Hallie turned 22, of a fever that took 3 families on their road that same wet season, and the start had died with her. Nobody left in the house with either the knowledge or the patience to keep it going, and within a month the crock behind the stove sat empty and was eventually pressed into service holding buttons. Hallie had not thought about it in years. She thought about it constantly, it turned out, the moment she needed to. What brought the thought back to her, sharp and sudden, was Josiah Petrie. Josiah Petrie had been Magpie Gulch's baker before there had ever been a Rance Colvin's counter to compete with him. An old man of perhaps 70, who had come out from Pennsylvania in the first rush of the diggings, and finding himself too slow and too stiff-handed for placer mining within his first season, had built instead a low bake shack of split logs and mud chinking at the upper end of camp, and fed miners real leavened bread out of it for the better part of 6 years. Hallie had eaten his bread exactly twice, both times in her first month in camp before her own tense accounts had tightened enough that she stopped spending money on anything she could make herself, cheaply, however poorly. She remembered it the way she remembered her mother's, sharp, clean, alive in a way flat cakes and saleratus loaves were not. Petrie had gone quiet through that second summer, the kind of quiet camps notice about their oldest residents without quite naming it, and by September he was baking only twice a week instead of daily, and by the first week of October he did not open the bake shack at all. A freighter found him on the 9th, dead in his own cot of what the camp's rough consensus called simply a bad chest and a hard age, no kin anyone knew of, no will, and a running account at Judson Pryor's store that had gone unsettled for the better part of a year. Camp custom on the matter was neither cruel nor especially sentimental. A man who died owing the only store within 2 days' ride had his effects sold to settle the account. The proceeds beyond that going into a common fund the camp used for the rare doctor's visit or burial expense, and Ambrose Teal, who kept the camp's rough ledger of claims and disputes and had, over 6 years, made himself the closest thing Magpie Gulch had to an auctioneer, announced the sale for the second Saturday of October, to be held in Pryor's own dooryard where the goods could be laid out and looked over. Petrie's bake shack itself had stood empty exactly 9 days by the morning of the sale, long enough that camp had already begun to feel its absence in small, practical ways nobody had thought to name until it was gone. No bread smell drifting down from the upper end of the road at dawn. No reason for a man finishing a hard week at the diggings to walk the extra quarter mile past his own claim before turning in. Ambrose Teal had known Petrie only as a name in his ledger and a face at the store counter, the way he knew most of camp. But he ran the sale with a rough decency all the same, laying the old man's goods out in the order they'd likely fetch the best prices and saving nothing back for himself, though he could easily have claimed the pick of the lot as payment for his trouble, and nobody in camp would have begrudged him it. The morning was cold enough that breath hung visible over the whole yard, and the men who gathered were the ordinary mix any camp sale drew. Freighters between runs, a handful of miners who'd walked down from claims too frozen to work that morning anyway, Judson Pryor himself standing near his own front door with the particular watchfulness of a storekeeper whose ledger stood to gain from whatever the sale brought in. Rance Colvin had arrived early and stayed close to the front, the way he generally did at any gathering where he might get the first word in on whatever was being said. Hallie had gone that morning with exactly 50 cents set aside for the purpose and no plan beyond it, because 50 cents was the entire surplus she could spare from a boarding tent already carrying $18.20 of debt against Judson Pryor's account book, a note that had been extended to her the previous winter to cover flour and salt pork through the lean months, and that Pryor had told her plainly, in the careful, unhurried way he told most things, needed settling in full by the 1st of April, or he would have no choice but to close her credit entirely. Hard news for any debtor, harder still for a woman running the only eating house on a freight road 110 miles from the next one. She had come to Petrie's sale hoping only for a decent skillet or a length of stovepipe, something small and useful that nobody else would bid hard for. The bake shack's goods went first, laid out on trestle boards Teal had borrowed from the very tables Hallie fed her boarders on. A dough trough went for $1.10 to a freighter who meant it for watering stock. A set of bread peels sold for 60 cents. Tins and pans and a battered set of scales sold in a lot for $1.40. And at the very back of the last table, pushed nearly against the store's rear wall, as though even Teal had not thought it worth better placement, sat a single stoneware crock, gray-brown and heavy, its side cracked clean through in a line that ran from the rim halfway to its base, its mouth sealed under a thick, dried, deeply cracked crust, the pale gray-tan color of old plaster. Hallie noticed it the way she noticed most things worth noticing, quietly and without announcing that she'd noticed. She walked to the back of the table while two freighters argued cheerfully over the scales, knelt down in the cold dirt in her good gray dress, and looked at it a long moment before she touched it at all. The crack ran deep. She could see daylight through it in one place, sealed only by whatever had dried and crusted along the seam from the inside. And any sensible person standing in that yard would have called the whole thing ruined on the strength of the crack alone, worth nothing more than the clay it was fired from. But it was the seal on top that held her attention. She worked her thumbnail under one edge of the crust, gently, and it gave with a small dry crack of its own, the way a scab gives, revealing beneath it a second layer, darker, denser, riddled through with tiny dried air pockets like a sponge that had been wrung out and left to bake in the sun. She leaned down and breathed in through the gap she'd made. It was not the smell of rot. Rot had a smell Hallie knew intimately from 14 months of running a boarding tent larder in a camp with no ice house. Swedish, sharp, unmistakably wrong. What came up out of that crock instead was sour. Yes, sour enough to catch at the back of her throat, but clean underneath it, faintly like buttermilk gone a little too long, faintly like the smell of bread dough itself before it ever saw an oven. It was, she realized, kneeling there with her breath fogging in the cold October air, almost exactly the smell that used to drift out from behind her mother's kitchen stove on a Tuesday morning in Missouri. A smell she had not encountered once in 6 years and would have sworn, if asked, that she'd forgotten entirely. She did not know, kneeling in that dirt, whether what was under that dried crust still had any life left in it. Dried was not the same as dead, not necessarily, but she had no way to test it standing in an auction yard with a scrap of paper and 50 cents in her glove, and she understood, working the crust carefully back into place so as not to disturb whatever lay beneath it, that whatever answer she got would cost her either way. The 50 cents if she was wrong, or something considerably more valuable if she let the crock go to whoever else might want it and later worked out, too late, what she'd let slip through her fingers. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked back toward the front of the yard to wait for Teal to reach the last lot. "Last lot!" Teal called out at last, once the crowd had thinned to the handful of men with nothing better to do than watch a dead man's belongings finish changing hands. "One stoneware crock, condition poor, contents unknown, and I'll be honest with you all, likely spoiled, cracked clean through one side. I wouldn't give you 2 bits for it myself. Floor's 50 cents. Do I hear 50 cents? "A nickel," Rance Colvin called out from where he stood near the store's front rail, to the general amusement of the 4 or 5 men closest to him. "And that's generous, Ambrose. Man's been dead near 2 weeks. Whatever's in that jar's had 2 weeks in the sun to finish going wrong." Teal grinned along with the laugh. "Can't sell it for a nickel, Rance, tempting as your generosity is. 50 cents. Anybody?" Hallie raised her hand. The yard went quiet for exactly as long as it takes a dozen men to decide they've heard correctly, and then it did not stay quiet at all. Teal actually said 50 cents, I have it, twice, the second time slower, the way a man double-checks a bid he suspects must be some kind of joke, and both times Hallie answered the same, flat and clear enough to carry across the yard. 50 cents. "Sold," Teal said finally, bringing an imaginary gavel, his own flattened palm, down against the table. "To Mrs. Winslow for a dead man's cracked jar of moldy paste. Congratulations." He said it with enough dry humor that even Hallie nearly smiled, though she let the moment pass without one. That was when Colvin's laugh rose loudest above the rest. A big, carrying laugh he used often enough behind his own counter that Hallie could have picked it out of a crowd blindfolded. 50 cents, he repeated, to the whole yard and to nobody in particular. "Mrs. Winslow, if you've got 50 cents burning that bad a hole in your apron, I'll gladly take it off your hands for something that hasn't been dead as long as Josiah Petrie's leftover flour paste." 2 of the freighters standing near him laughed outright, and a third called out something about how at least the Crock's crack would let the smell out before it reached her tent. Hallie let it run its course. She had learned, in 14 months of being the only woman running her own business on that stretch of road, that a camp's laughter was a kind of weather. Arguing with it only prolonged it, while standing still and paying the auctioneer cost her nothing but a few uncomfortable minutes. She counted the 2 coins into Teal's palm, signed the scrap of paper that made the crock legally hers, and looked up to find one man in that yard who had not laughed at all. He stood near the mule string at the yard's edge, broad through the shoulders despite a stoop that suggested 60 years or more, a battered slouch hat pulled low and a coat too heavy for the morning's chill, as though he felt the cold more than most men did. He caught her eye once, briefly, and something in his face was not amusement at all, but closer to recognition. The look of a man doing arithmetic of his own and arriving silently at a different answer than the rest of the yard. He came forward without being asked, once the crowd had begun drifting off toward the store's front counter, and lifted the heavier end of the crock onto the borrowed mule's pack saddle without a word about the foolishness of the purchase or the weight of the thing either. "Obliged to you," Hallie said, once it was lashed down. "Willard Pace," the man said, touching 2 fingers to his hat brim. "Freight up to Ruby Bar and back most weeks when the road's passable. Cooked chuck wagon for 11 years before that down south before the war with Mexico ever ended and after." He looked at the crock a moment longer, the way she herself had looked at it kneeling in the dirt. "That crack's bad," he said finally. "But a crack in the clay's not the same as a death in what's inside it. Man doesn't die because his house has a crack in the wall." It was the first thing anyone had said to her all morning that matched what she'd found kneeling in the cold, and Hallie filed the name away carefully. Willard Pace, freighter, old trail cook, a man who looked at a ruin and thought first about what might still be living inside it. She did not talk much on the ride back to her own tent, which was unusual for her. On ordinary days, she kept up a low, steady commentary to whatever animal she was leading, a habit born of 14 months mostly alone. That afternoon, she rode home in something closer to silence, feeling the crock shift against its ropes with every rut in the frozen road, turning over again and again, the particular weight of having exactly no surplus left in the world, and a great deal riding, in every sense the word could carry, on a cracked jar most of the camp had just finished laughing at twice in the same hour. The road home passed within sight of Judson Pryor's own front window, where the ledger holding her $18.20 sat, she knew, in a drawer behind the counter, waiting on the 1st of April, the way a held breath waits on release. She looked at that window a moment longer than she needed to and thought, without any particular self-pity, only arithmetic, about how very little separated a boarding tent still standing from one Pryor eventually closed the book on. She reached her own tent, as the light was going long and gold across the ridge above camp, unhitched the mule, and carried the crock inside with both arms, setting it down on the plank table where the morning light would strike it first. She did not try to open the seal properly that evening. It was near dark, and she had learned enough, even from a girlhood spent watching her own mother tend a crock exactly like this one, to know that a proper first look at what 50 cents had actually bought her deserved better light than a dying afternoon could give it. Sunday morning came in clean and cold, and Hallie carried her coffee out to the plank table before she'd finished drinking it, because she had lain awake a good part of the night rehearsing what she might find. She worked the dried crust free with the same borrowed knife, prying it loose in 3 brittle pieces that came away like the lid of an old paint tin, and looked, for the first time in good light, at what was underneath. It was not a jar of paste, exactly, though she understood at once why every man in that yard had assumed it was. What filled the lower 2/3 of the crock was a mass gone hard and cracked and deeply fissured, the color of wet sand gone dry, pulled away from the crock's sides in places to leave gaps like a dry creek bed in August. She broke off a small piece and crumbled it between her fingers. It did not smell of rot, up close, in daylight, any more than it had in the cold dirt of the auction yard. It smelled sharp and clean and unmistakably faintly of bread that had never quite gotten the chance to become bread. She remembered the shape of what came next only in pieces, the way a person remembers a lesson learned second-hand and half a lifetime ago, watching her mother's hands rather than her own. Flour and water, she remembered that much clearly, worked into whatever remained of the old start and left somewhere warm to see whether anything in it still had the will to work. She mixed her first attempt that same Sunday afternoon, warming her water at the cook fire until it was pleasantly warm to the wrist, the way she remembered, and stirred it into a crumbled portion of the dried start along with a careful spoonful of flour, and covered the crock with a clean cloth, and waited. By Monday evening, nothing had happened at all. No bubble, no rise, no change in the smell beyond a faint staleness that worried her more than the flat silence of the mixture itself. She had used, by her own careful count in the ledger she kept for the tent's accounts, nearly a full cup of flour on that first attempt. Flour she had bought on credit from Pryor's shelf only that Saturday, 20 cents worth added straight onto an account already $18.20 deep. And by Monday night she had nothing to show for it but a bowl of thin, sour paste going nowhere. She sat with the ledger open that night and made herself write the entry honestly, the way her mother had always insisted a true account got written, whether it flattered you or not. Crock, Petrie Estate, 50 cents, flour, first attempt, 20 cents. No result. She looked at that second line for a long while before she blew out the lamp. She tried again Tuesday morning, and this time she made herself slower about it, remembering more carefully. Her mother had never used water straight off the fire, had always let it cool until it was no warmer than a hand could comfortably rest in. Because water too hot, Hallie now recalled with the particular clarity of a mistake finally understood, killed outright whatever small living thing was meant to wake up in the mixture, the same way a plant scalded at the root would never green again regardless of how much water followed after. She had made her water too warm on Sunday. She had, in her impatience, very nearly finished off in an afternoon what 14 months of cold and neglect in Josiah Petrie's dead hands had failed to finish off entirely. Tuesday's mixture she kept properly warm rather than hot, wrapped in a wool blanket and set near the cook fire but never against it, and she fed it again Wednesday morning with a smaller, more careful measure of flour and water in equal parts, the way she now remembered her mother doing it, not drowning the old start in fresh material all at once, but coaxing it forward a little at a time. By Wednesday evening, she saw it. A scatter of small bubbles across the surface, no bigger than pinpricks. And when she leaned close, the smell had changed. Sharper, livelier, unmistakably the smell she remembered from behind her mother's stove, rather than the flat staleness of 2 days before. She touched the surface with one finger and felt it give slightly, the faintest suggestion of texture where there had been none. It was not yet bread. It was not yet anything a stranger walking into her tent could have told her was worth 50 cents, let alone the 20 more she'd spent chasing it. But it was, unmistakably, alive. And Hallie Winslow sat at her own table in the last of the evening light with her hands still resting against the Crock's rim, and felt something she had not let herself feel, since her father's grave was still raw on that ridge above the Perseverance claim, the particular cautious lightness of a thing that has been given back its chance. Word of the Crock reached the rest of Magpie Gulch inside of 3 days, the way word of anything unusual traveled that fast on a road with so little else to talk about. By the time Hallie walked into Judson Pryor's store on Thursday for more flour, she understood from the particular quality of the quiet that fell over the 2 men loitering near the stove that they already knew, and were only waiting to see whether she'd give them the satisfaction of looking embarrassed about it. She did not give them the satisfaction. She set a coin on the counter and asked for flour, and Pryor weighed it out himself, entering the sale into his ledger with the same careful, unhurried hand he used for every transaction in that store, then set down his pen and looked at her over his spectacles in a way that told her the conversation wasn't quite finished. "Second time this week you've bought flour and nothing else, Mrs. Winslow," he said. "Ordinarily, a woman running a boarding tent buys salt pork alongside it, or coffee, or beans. Flour alone, twice, tells me you're either baking a great deal more bread than you're selling, or you're feeding that Crock everybody's talking about." "Both, in a manner of speaking," Hallie said. Pryor considered that a moment, the way he considered most things, weighing it the same careful way he weighed flour. "I don't say this unkindly," he said, "because I've carried your account 18 months now and never once regretted it. But you owe this store $18.20, due whole by the 1st of April, and every dime you spend on flour for an experiment is a dime further from that number rather than closer to it. I'd rather see you clear of debt than watch you chase a dead man's mold jar into a deeper hole." "It isn't mold," Hallie said. "I've smelled mold plenty, running a larder in this camp. This is something else." She did not explain further because she had already learned in the 3 days since the auction that an explanation only bought her a longer argument, not a more sympathetic one. Rance Colvin, seated near the stove with a cup of coffee he'd bought off Pryor's own shelf rather than make himself, had clearly been waiting for his own opening. "She's raising it like a sick calf, Judson," he said. Not quite to Pryor, and not quite to Hallie either, the way a man talks when he means to be overheard by both. "Feeding it flour, keeping it warm by the fire. I half expect to hear she's given it a name." "I haven't given it a name," Hallie said, "though I appreciate the suggestion." "Camp's already given it one," Colvin said, grinning now, pleased with himself. "The boys up at the diggings are calling you the Gulch's own resurrection woman, raising the dead, 1 jar at a time." A couple of the men near the door laughed at that, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular relish men reserve for a joke that costs them nothing and might, if they're lucky, turn out to be true entertainment for weeks yet to come. Hallie let it pass the same way she'd let the auction yard's laughter pass, without argument, because arguing with a joke only fed it. "I'll take the flour, Mr. Pryor," she said, "and I'll thank you to keep a running tally of what I owe against it, same as everything else. I mean to settle every cent of it by the 1st of April, same as the rest of the account." "I intend to," Pryor said, not unkindly entering the sale, "though I confess I don't yet see how a jar of resurrected paste is going to help you do it." She rode home with the flour balanced across her lap, and the running total in her head climbing toward $2 now. All of it spent on an experiment that had produced, so far, nothing she could point to and call proof. She was aware, riding past Colvin's plank counter with its stacked flapjacks and its steady trickle of customers, of exactly how thin the difference looked, from the outside, between a woman with a plan and a woman with nothing but a stubborn refusal to admit a mistake. She had been on the wrong side of that particular question before, in the year since her father died, and she had learned that the only honest way to tell the difference, in the moment itself, was that a mistake felt like avoidance and a plan felt like work. What she was doing felt, whatever the men at Pryor's stove wanted to call it, entirely like work. She fed the start again that evening, patient now, watching for the small bubbles that had become, in the space of a week, the most reliable good news in her entire day. The start's true test, Hallie understood, was never going to be whether it lived. By the second week of tending it lived unmistakably, doubling in its crock within 6 or 7 hours of a feeding, smelling sharp and clean and faintly of green apples the way she now remembered her mother's kitchen smelling every Tuesday of her childhood, bubbling visibly when she stirred it. The true test was whether she could still remember or relearn how to turn that living thing into bread a stranger would pay money for. She had watched her mother do it 100 times as a girl without ever once doing it herself from beginning to end, which she now understood was its own kind of lesson, the difference between having seen a thing done and having done it. She began in the second half of October feeding the crock twice a day rather than once, a small portion of flour and water stirred in each morning and each evening, and this was the part that had taken her the longest to remember correctly, pouring off and discarding roughly half the mixture before each feeding, rather than simply adding more on top of what was already there. It had seemed, the first time she did it, like throwing away the very thing she'd worked so hard to bring back to life, and she'd stood over the slop bucket with a full cup of living start in her hand for a long moment before she made herself pour it in. But a crock fed without ever being thinned, she remembered her mother saying once, in passing, the way a person passes on a lesson they don't realize is important until it's needed, would eventually grow too large and too sour to work with, souring past the point of good bread into something closer to vinegar. The discarding was not waste. It was the difference between a start that stayed young enough to raise a loaf properly and one that aged itself into uselessness. She came to understand, turning the whole process over in her mind through those first weeks of tending it, why her mother's method had never once depended on a peddler's wagon the way Rance Colvin's saleratus bread did. Saleratus itself, the same mineral leaven most camp cooks reached for when they had nothing better, worked well enough, but it worked only in the presence of something sour to react against, a cup of buttermilk or soured milk or a splash of vinegar, and it worked all at once, in the single sharp burst of a chemical reaction rather than the slow patient multiplication of something alive. A camp that ran short of buttermilk, as Magpie Gulch generally did the moment its one milk cow went dry through the winter months, found its saleratus bread turning heavy and faintly bitter, the soda's flat mineral taste no longer masked by enough acid to balance it. A living start needed none of that. It carried its own sourness inside itself, generation after generation, asking nothing of the camp around it beyond flour, water, and warmth. 3 things Magpie Gulch could supply through the worst month of any winter, when buttermilk and fresh yeast cakes both were the first small comforts any camp lost. It was, she came to think, less a matter of one method being better than the other in some abstract sense, and more a matter of which method survived the specific hardship of the place it was asked to work in. Saleratus bread suited a settled town with a reliable dairy and a store that restocked itself every season. A living start suited a camp 2 days from anywhere, where the only truly reliable ingredient, once flour and water were accounted for, was patience. The kneading itself came back to her hands faster than the reasoning behind it came back to her mind. She worked the dough on her scrubbed plank table each morning now, flour dusting her forearms to the elbow, the rhythm settling into something almost meditative across the last week of October. Press, fold, turn, press again, the dough slowly tightening under her palms from a ragged, sticky mass into something smooth and faintly resistant, pushing back against her hands the way a properly developed dough was supposed to. She learned to judge hydration by feel rather than by any measure she could have written down for someone else to follow exactly. A dough too wet spread rather than held its shape, sticking stubbornly to her fingers no matter how she floured them. A dough too dry tore instead of stretching, cracking at the edges when she tried to fold it. The right balance sat somewhere in between, a dough that clung faintly to her palm for a moment before releasing clean, and she came, across a dozen practice batches that first fortnight, to trust her own hands to find that balance before her mind had finished working out the reason for it. She learned, too, to read the start's own rhythm as carefully as she read the dough, because a start fed too cold rose sluggishly and gave a dense, tight crumb even when everything else about the bake went right, while a start kept properly warm, near the cook fire but never against it, wrapped in wool through the coldest nights, worked fast and lively and gave bread with the open, irregular crumb she remembered from her mother's table. Cold, she came to understand, was not simply an inconvenience to work around. It was the one variable, more than flour or water or even her own growing skill, that decided whether a day's bake succeeded or failed. And she began, that same week, to think a great deal more seriously about what a mountain winter was going to ask of a crock that needed to stay warm through months when everything else in camp was doing everything it could simply to stay from freezing solid. Her first true attempt at bread came on the 23rd of October, mixing a portion of the lively start into a bowl of flour and salt, and a little more warm water, kneading it on her scrubbed plank table the way she remembered her mother's hands moving, pressing the heel of her palm into the dough, folding it back over itself, turning it a quarter turn, pressing again, a rhythm that came back to her hands, she found, a good deal faster than it had come back to her memory. She worked it for the better part of 20 minutes, until the dough went from a ragged, sticky mass to something smooth and faintly elastic under her palms, the way she remembered a properly worked dough was supposed to feel. Like a thing that pushed back against her rather than simply yielding. She had no proper place to let it rise beyond a covered bowl set near the cook fire, and no proper oven at all beyond the flat iron skillet and the reflector plate she used for camp cooking, propped near the open fire to bake anything that needed baking. She let the dough rise through the afternoon, watching it climb slowly in the bowl, pressing a floured finger into it the way she remembered testing readiness. A dent that filled back in slowly, holding its shape at the edges, was the sign her mother had always watched for. Dough neither too young to hold its structure nor so far gone it had lost its strength entirely. The first loaf, baked in the skillet under an overturned pot with coals banked around it, came out badly. The outside scorched black in patches before the inside had finished cooking at all, leaving a raw, gummy center no amount of additional time seemed to fix without burning the crust past eating. She lost, by her own count that evening, close to a full measure of flour and the better part of an afternoon to that single ruined loaf. And when she finally cut into it and found the pale, wet dough still clinging to the knife, she sat down at her own table and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of feeling precisely as foolish as Rance Colvin believed her to be, before she got back up and started again. The second attempt, baked smaller and given more time over a gentler fire, came out better but still wrong, dense through the middle, heavy in a way she remembered her mother's bread never being, with none of the open, airy crumbs she could picture clearly enough in memory, even if she couldn't yet produce it with her own hands. She traced the fault, after turning the failure over in her mind for the better part of a day, to the fire itself rather than the dough. A skillet and a reflector plate gave heat from one direction at a time, uneven and impossible to control, when what bread wanted, what she remembered now that she thought hard about it, seeing through the little iron door of her mother's own cook stove, was heat that surrounded the loaf evenly on every side at once, steady and sustained, the kind of heat a skillet over an open fire simply could not give no matter how carefully she tended it. She wrote the failures into her ledger honestly, the way she'd been taught. Flour, second attempt, scorched, unsaleable. Flour, third attempt, dense, unsaleable. 2 more small sums added to a running total that now stood, by her own reckoning, at just short of $2 spent on an education nobody in Magpie Gulch believed she was receiving. But she had learned something in those 2 ruined loaves that mattered a good deal more than the flour they'd cost her. The start itself worked. It rose. It smelled right. It kneaded and stretched the way bread dough was supposed to. What stood between her and real bread was no longer a question of whether a dead man's jar still held anything living. It was a question of heat, of an oven she did not have and would need, somehow, to build. She thought about that problem through the last week of October, turning it over the way she turned over every number in her ledger. And she thought, more than once, about the quiet freighter who had helped her load the crock without laughing at it. A man, she recalled him saying, who had cooked chuck wagon for 11 years before he ever came west, which meant, she reasoned, a man who had likely built and fed a great many fires meant to cook things properly in places with considerably less to work with than a mining camp on a settled freight road. She found Willard Pace on the last Saturday of October, back from a freight run up to Ruby Bar, unloading grain sacks at the upper end of camp, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been doing the same motions for the better part of 30 years and saw no reason to hurry them now. "I need to build an oven," Hallie said without much preamble, because she had learned that Pace responded better to a plain statement than a long explanation. "A real one, something that holds heat evenly on every side of a loaf, not a skillet and a prayer." Pace set down the sack he was carrying and looked at her for a moment with an expression she was coming to recognize as his version of genuine interest. "You get that jar working, then?" "I did. Figured you might." He wiped his hands on his coat. "Cooked for a cattle outfit 11 years before I ever came out here, like I told you. We built ovens the same way most trail crews built them, when we stayed anywhere long enough to bother. Dug a fire pit, lined it with fieldstone for the floor, and built a dome up over the top out of clay and sand, and a good deal of chopped straw worked through it to hold the whole thing together while it dried. Beehive shape, same as an old brick oven back east, only made from whatever a place actually had lying around instead of quarried brick. Will it work up here? The ground's half stone as it is." "Better here than most places," Pace said. "You've got fieldstone enough for the floor and the footing without hauling it far. And there's a clay seam runs along the creek bank below the store. Good red clay, sticky when it's wet. Sand and straw we can manage easy enough." He considered her a moment longer. "It's slow work, done right. Man in a hurry ends up with a pile of cracked mud and nothing to show for a week's labor." Hallie studied him a moment, curious despite the cold. 11 years on a trail crew is a long time to spend around cook fires and not much else. "Longer than most men last at it," Pace said, without much drama in the admission. "Cooked for outfits driving cattle up from Texas before the war with Mexico properly ended, and for a few years after, until the work dried up and freighting paid steadier. Buried 2 cooks I trained myself, one to fever and one to a fall crossing the Pecos, and outlasted 3 trail bosses who all told me at one time or another that a chuck wagon cook was the most replaceable man on the whole outfit, right up until the day the coffee ran cold and the beans ran raw and they discovered otherwise. He said it without bitterness, the way a man recounts a fact rather than a grievance. Built my first oven at 19, out of nothing but river clay and a fool's confidence, and cracked it clean through the first week for exactly the reason I expect we'll crack yours if we hurry. Some lessons a man only really learns once he's paid for them himself. I'd rather you paid for yours in flour than in a whole winter's trade. They began the following Monday, the 1st of November, working through the last mild weather before the mountain winter closed in properly. Pace showed her how to build the floor first. A bed of field stone laid flat and packed with sand beneath it for insulation, tamped firm until it neither rocked nor shifted underfoot, because a floor that moved once the oven was fired would crack the whole structure from beneath, before the dome above it ever had the chance to fail on its own. Over that stone floor they built a dome-shaped mound of damp sand, packed and shaped by hand into roughly the size and curve Hallie wanted the finished oven's interior to hold, a form, Pace explained, that they would bury under layers of clay, and then, once the clay had cured hard enough to hold its own shape, dig back out again through a single small door, leaving the sand-shaped hollow behind as the oven's true interior. The clay itself was the slower work by far. They hauled it up from the creek bank in buckets, worked it with water on a canvas sheet until it held together without crumbling, then mixed in sand to keep it from shrinking too violently as it dried and chopped straw, worked through by hand until the whole mass held together like a coarse, fibrous dough of its own. Not so different, Hallie thought more than once, working her hands through the wet clay, from kneading bread itself, the same instinct for when a mixture had been worked enough and when it had been worked too much. Pace was particular about the clay in a way that surprised her at first, testing each batch by rolling a thumb-thick rope of it between his palms and bending it slowly into a ring. Clay that cracked badly at the bend needed more water worked through it or more time resting under a damp cloth before use. Clay that held the bend clean, with only fine hairline cracks along its outer curve, was ready. Too much sand, and it won't hold together at all, he told her, working a fresh batch through his hands. Too little, and it shrinks itself apart the first time it dries. There's no fixed measure I can hand you. You learn the mixture the same way you're learning that dough of yours, by feeling when it's wrong before you can rightly say why. They built the dome up over the sand form in layers, each layer a few inches thick, letting each one firm before adding the next, because clay applied too thick and too fast simply slumped under its own weight before it had the chance to hold together. Pace showed her, too, how to leave the door opening properly proportioned as they built. Too large, and the oven would never hold its heat once the fire came out. Too small, and she'd never manage to work a full-sized loaf in and out of it on a peel without scorching her knuckles against the hot clay every single time. They settled on an opening roughly the width of two spread hands, framed with a low arch of flatter stones, set carefully so the weight of the dome above bore down evenly on either side of it rather than pressing straight down into open air. A chimney was not strictly necessary, Pace told her, not for an oven fired the old way, fire built and burned down inside the chamber itself, rather than vented separately. The smoke found its own way out the door opening while the fire burned, and once the coals were raked clear for baking, there was no more smoke left to vent at all, only clean, stored heat radiating back out of stone and clay that had spent the whole morning soaking it in. It took the better part of 9 days to bring the dome to its full thickness, working an hour or two most evenings after Hallie's own tent had been fed and cleared for the night, and by the second week of November, they had something that looked, at a distance, almost exactly like the low, rounded ovens Hallie remembered from illustrations in an old book of her mother's, squatting at the edge of her cook-fire pit under a rough plank shelter Pace had built over it to keep the weather off while it cured. The building itself drew its own audience before the oven was ever fired even once. A supply train came through on the 8th of November, 6 heavy freight wagons bound up grade for Ruby Bar and the claims beyond it, and its arrival was, as it always was in a camp with little else to mark the passing weeks, An occasion, most of Magpie Gulch turned out to see what the wagons carried and trade news with drivers who'd come up from towns considerably larger than any camp on that road. Rance Colvin set up an extra griddle for the day's trade and did brisk business among the freighters, and more than one of them, walking down toward the corral afterward, passed close enough by Hallie's half-built dome to ask, cheerfully enough, whether Magpie Gulch had taken up building its own root cellar or its own tomb, because they couldn't rightly tell which from the look of it. Colvin, working his griddle within easy earshot of the whole exchange, did not let the opening pass him by. "Tell them the truth of it, Mrs. Winslow," he called over, loud enough to carry to the wagons and the corral both. "Tell them you're building an oven out of mud to bake bread out of a dead man's jar, and let them decide for themselves whether that's a root cellar or a tomb." The freighters laughed, not unkindly exactly, the easy laughter of men glad for anything to break up a long day on the road, and one of them called back that he'd heard tell of the jar already, 3 camps back, and hadn't quite believed it was a true story until he saw the mud pile with his own eyes. Hallie kept working the clay through her hands without looking up, because she had found, across a month of exactly this kind of exchange, that the fastest way through a joke was straight, without pausing to argue it. It was the curing itself that undid them the first time. Clay dried too fast. Pace had warned her more than once, cracked from the outside in before the moisture deep inside the walls had any chance to work its own way out, and the proper cure took small fires, built gradually larger over the better part of a week, coaxing the moisture out slowly rather than driving it out all at once. Hallie understood the warning. She did not, in the event, have the patience for it that the warning required, because the 3rd week of November brought an early hard frost that threatened, if it settled in for good, to make outdoor clay work impossible until spring, and she pushed the curing schedule harder than Pace advised, building larger fires sooner than he thought wise, because she had run the numbers in her ledger more than once that week and did not see how she could afford to lose an entire winter's baking season to caution. On the 17th of November, with a fire built larger and hotter than any they'd yet risked inside the still-curing dome, Hallie heard, from inside her own tent, 40 yards off, a sound like a rifle shot, sharp and sudden, and ran out to find a jagged crack running the full height of the oven's north face, a section of the dome near the crown sagging visibly inward, and a thin plume of smoke escaping from the new gap where none had escaped before. She stood in front of the ruin for a long moment in the cold evening air, feeling something considerably heavier than the disappointment of a scorched loaf. She had lost, by the time she and Pace finished raking the fire out and assessing the damage, the better part of a day's cut-and-split hardwood burned for nothing, and, because she had proofed a full batch of dough that same afternoon, meaning to bake the oven's first proper loaves that very evening, a bowl of dough left standing too long while they fought the collapsing fire, gone sour and slack past any hope of saving, worth, by her own honest count, entered into the ledger that night close to 60 cents of flour and labor combined. Oven, first firing, cracked. Dough, ruined, approximately 60 cents. Lesson, haste costs more than patience. "Told you it wanted slow fires," Pace said, not unkindly, surveying the damage by lantern light. "You did," Hallie said. "I heard you. I didn't listen closely enough." Word of the collapse reached Rance Colvin's counter as word of everything did within a day, and this time the mockery had a harder edge to it than the auction yards had, because a cracked oven was a visible, undeniable failure in a way a jar of paste quietly working on a back table had never been. Heard the resurrection woman's built herself a cave to match her jar, Colvin said to a knot of freighters buying flapjacks off his counter, loud enough that it reached Hallie's own tent on the wind. Man could lose his whole winter's stake chasing a notion like that. A couple of the freighters, men Hallie had fed 100 times over the past 14 months, laughed along with him, and one, not unkindly, but with the particular weariness of a man who'd watched too many camp ventures fail to bet on a new one, suggested to a companion, within Hallie's hearing, that she ought to cut her losses before she poured any more good flour after bad clay. It was, by Hallie's own private accounting that week, the lowest point since the auction itself. She had close to $2 sunk into flour experiments, 60 cents more lost to a ruined batch of dough, a full day's labor and hard wood burned for nothing, a cracked oven standing half-collapsed behind her tent as a visible monument to the whole venture's foolishness, and $18.20 still standing against her name at Pryor's store with the 1st of April drawing steadily closer. She sat at her table that night with the ledger open in front of her, the columns of small, honest losses running down the page, and made herself look at the whole of it plainly rather than flinching from it, because flinching from a bad number had never once, in her experience, made the number smaller. What she found, looking at it plainly, was not ruin. It was a mistake, clearly identified, with a clear enough cause that she and Pace could correct it. The dome had failed at the crown, where the walls were thinnest and the curing fires had reached hottest fastest, not because the method was wrong, but because she had rushed a process that punished rushing. She and Pace rebuilt through the last week of November, this time thickening the crown by a full 2 inches beyond what the first attempt had used, and firing it with small, contained fires no larger than a cook fire for the first 4 full days, increasing the size only gradually, watching the walls for the faint moisture steam that told them the clay was still drying rather than yet ready for real heat. It held. By the 2nd of December, the oven had taken 11 days of patient, graduated firing without a single crack showing anywhere along its walls, and Hallie judged it, at last, ready for its first true test. Pace had taught her the old trail method for judging an oven's heat without any thermometer to rely on, a method he said he'd learned from a cook older than himself who'd learned it, in turn, from somewhere further back than either of them could trace with any certainty. Build the fire full and hot inside the dome itself for the better part of 2 hours, until the soot blackening the oven's interior walls burned away entirely, and the stone and clay beneath showed pale and clean, nearly white in the firelight. Rake the coals and ash out then, every ember, sweep the floor clean with a wet cloth tied to a long pole, and toss a small scoop of flour across the swept stone. Flour that blackened and smoked instantly meant the oven ran too hot yet for bread and needed a few minutes more to ease back. Flour that browned slowly, evenly, taking a slow count of 10 or 12 before it caught color at all, meant the heat sat exactly where bread wanted it. Hallie built the fire before dawn on the 2nd of December, fed it steadily through the cold gray hours of the morning, and watched, with a patience she had not entirely believed herself capable of a month earlier, as the soot inside the dome burned away by slow degrees until the stone floor showed pale and clean. She raked the coals, swept the floor, and tossed her scoop of flour across it with hands that were not quite steady. It browned slowly, evenly, catching color at a count of 11. She had 2 loaves proofed and waiting, shaped and rested under a clean cloth since well before first light, dough that had doubled properly, that held the dent of a floured finger the way her mother's dough always had. She slid them into the oven's mouth on the long wooden peel Pace had shaped for her from a length of seasoned pine, closed the small iron door over the opening, and made herself walk away and tend to her boarder's breakfast, rather than stand in front of the oven willing it to work through sheer nervous attention. She opened the door 40 minutes later to a smell that stopped her cold in the doorway of her own tent. Not the sour, flat smell of the crock alone, not the scorched failure of the skillet, but something whole and finished and unmistakably entirely right, warm bread and toasted crust, and the particular sharp sourness underneath it all that she had not smelled, outside her own memory, in 6 years. She lifted the first loaf free with the peel and set it on the plank table to cool, and stood looking at it for a long moment before she trusted herself to touch it. The crust had gone a deep burnished gold, cracked and crackling audibly as it cooled, blistered in places the way she remembered good crust, always blistering. When she finally cut into it, the inside showed open and irregular, full of the small, uneven holes she remembered from her mother's table, not the dense, wet gray of her earlier failures, but something alive-looking even cut open and still. She carried a warm slice out to where Willard Pace was splitting kindling, and held it out to him without a word. He took it, looked at her, and ate it. He chewed slowly the way he did most things, and when he'd swallowed, he looked at the loaf still cooling on her table and said only, "How many more of those can that oven hold at once?" "4, maybe 5, depending how I shape them." He nodded slowly, turning something over behind his eyes the way she'd come to recognize as his particular brand of arithmetic. "You'd best start thinking bigger than 4 or 5 then," he said. "Word of a smell like that doesn't stay quiet on a road this short." He was right, and it did not take long to prove him so. Hallie sold her first loaves properly on the 5th of December, 3 days after that first true bake, setting a rough plank counter across the front of her tent beside the boarding entrance and a hand-lettered notice. Bread, 25 cents a loaf, fresh mornings and evenings, that she nailed to the post beside it more out of formality than any real expectation that word hadn't already outrun the sign. It had. 2 freighters bound up road for Ruby Bar bought a loaf apiece before she'd even finished setting the counter up, having heard, they said, from a man who'd eaten supper at her tent 2 nights before and could not stop talking about it at the mule corral the next morning. By the 2nd week of December, she was selling out most mornings within an hour of the first batch coming out of the oven, and baking a second batch most afternoons to meet an evening trade that had begun, to her genuine surprise, to include miners who lived and worked well up the gulch and had no particular reason to pass her tent at all, except that they had started making the walk deliberately. She kept the numbers the way she kept every number that mattered to her, entered honestly each evening in the same ledger that held her failures. 9 loaves sold the first day, 14 the second, 22 by the end of that first full week, the 25 cents a loaf accumulating into figures that felt, after weeks of watching only debts and losses climb, strange and unfamiliar in the best possible way. She remembered her first true line at the window, not simply a customer or 2 waiting, but an actual line, 6 men deep, forming on the cold morning of the 9th of December, word having traveled overnight that she'd baked a double batch the evening before. She sold through it in under half an hour, the last 2 men in line good-natured about missing out entirely and asking only that she set 2 loaves aside for them the following morning, which she did and which became, within another week, its own small standing custom. Men leaving their names with her the evening before if they couldn't be certain of reaching her window before the morning's bake sold through. She kept that list, too, in the same ledger as everything else, because a name written down and honored was, she'd come to believe, worth a great deal more to a business on a freight road than any amount of talk about how good the bread tasted. Not every customer that December came easily. A grizzled placer miner named for his claim rather than anything else Camp bothered to call him arrived at her window the 2nd week, skeptical in the particular flat way of a man who had already made up his mind and only wanted the chance to be proven right about it, and asked whether the bread was really worth 5 cents more than what Colvin charged for a whole stack of flapjacks. Hallie cut him a slice from a cooling loaf without a word, handed it to him, and let him decide for himself. He ate it standing at her counter, said nothing for a long moment, and then set his coin down and asked for 2 loaves instead of the one he'd come meaning to buy. He became, over the following weeks, one of her steadiest customers, and never again brought up Colvin's flapjacks in her hearing, though she noticed more than once that he'd taken to needling Colvin himself about them instead, with the particular relish of a recent convert. Rance Colvin's own counter, 20 yards up the road, felt the change before he ever said a word about it directly. Hallie noticed the way she noticed most things about her own small stretch of road, that the line at his plank counter had thinned by the second week of December to a fraction of what it had run through most of the fall. Men who'd bought his flat cakes and tough flapjacks out of simple lack of any better option, now walking the extra 30 yards to her own window instead. He did not concede anything aloud, not that December, but she caught him twice in the space of a single week, watching her own counter's line from his own empty one with an expression that had considerably less mockery in it than it had a month before. Judson Pryor noticed differently and said so plainly the way he said most things. She came into his store on the 12th of December to pay $4 against her account, the largest single payment she'd made against the $18.20 since the debt was first extended to her. And he entered it into his ledger, then looked at her over his spectacles with an expression she had not yet seen him wear in her direction. "I confess, Mrs. Winslow," he said, "I did not expect to be entering a payment this size against your account before the new year, let alone before the first thaw. I said as much to my own wife not 2 weeks past, when the talk of your oven collapsing first reached the counter. I nearly proved you right," Hallie said. "The oven cracked the first time we fired it. Cost me the better part of a day's wood and 60 cents of good dough. And yet here we are." Pryor set down his pen. "I'll say this much plainly, because I think you've earned a plain word rather than a polite one. I extended you credit 18 months ago because I judged you a woman who paid what she owed, not because I had any particular faith in a boarding tent surviving a second hard winter on this road. I did not extend it expecting bread. I'm glad to have been wrong about the shape the repayment would take." Even Ambrose Teal, who had auctioned the Crock off with a joke about resurrected paste, stopped at her counter on the 16th of December on his way through camp, bought 2 loaves without a word of irony about it, and told her, counting out 50 cents, that he'd sold a great many strange lots off a great many dead men's estates over 6 years running that camp's sales, and never once, until now, had one of them come back to buy him breakfast. The starter itself became its own small trade before December was out, in a way Hallie had not entirely anticipated when she first began coaxing it back to life at her own kitchen table. It began simply enough. A miner who boarded with her most weeks, a quiet man named for nothing more than his trade as a placer digger, asked one evening whether she might spare him a cupful of the living start to carry back to his own claim, where he and 2 partners had been eating flat cakes fried in bacon grease for the better part of a year and had grown, in his own words, thoroughly tired of them. Hallie measured him out a cupful from the Crock's healthy surplus. She was discarding nearly as much as she used in her own baking now, feeding it twice daily to keep pace with her growing trade, and charged him a dime for it, more out of habit of charging something for anything that left her larder than any real calculation of what a cupful of living starter was actually worth. Word of that transaction spread nearly as fast as word of the bread itself had, and by the 3rd week of December, she was selling starter by the cupful 3 or 4 times a week, a dime apiece, to miners and camp cooks up and down the gulch who wanted the same thing she had wanted back in October: real leavened bread, or at least real flapjacks, without depending on yeast cakes that never survived the road intact. She explained the tending of it patiently to anyone who asked, and honestly enough about the failures that had taught her. The water too hot the first time, the danger of feeding without discarding, the particular smell that told a person their start had gone properly sour rather than properly bad, because she had come to believe, turning it over in her own mind some evenings, that a secret jealously guarded was worth a great deal less to her, in the long run, than a whole camp of customers who understood exactly what made her bread worth the extra 15 cents over Colvin's flat cakes. It was Willard Pace who explained to her, one cold evening in late December, while they split kindling together for the next morning's fire, why a live start mattered so much more out here than it ever had back in Missouri. Trail cooks used to prize a good start the way a man prizes a good horse, he said. Better, some of them, because a horse could be replaced at the next town easy enough, and a start that had been fed and carried and kept alive for years running could not be replaced at all. Not out here. Not once you were 3 weeks from the nearest bakery. I knew men who kept theirs in a pouch tied round the neck under their shirt of a cold night, close against their own skin, same as you'd carry something you couldn't afford to let freeze. Called some of the old ones sourdoughs on account of it, up and down these camps. Not on account of the bread being sour, though it was that too, but on account of a man who'd kept the same start alive through enough winters that he'd earned the name honestly. Hallie thought about that a great deal in the days that followed, turning the phrase over the way she turned over every useful piece of information that came her way. She had not thought of herself, tending her crock morning and evening at her own kitchen table, as doing anything especially remarkable. She began to understand, hearing Pace describe it, that what she was keeping alive in that cracked stoneware jar was not simply a convenience. It was, in a camp this far from anywhere, very nearly the only insurance the whole gulch had against a winter with no real bread in it at all. That insurance was tested sooner and harder than she expected. The snow came early and hard that year, closing in through the first week of January, with a series of storms that buried the upper road under drifts deep enough to stop wagon traffic entirely for days at a stretch. And it was during a brief clear spell in the second week of January that Willard Pace came down off a freight run to Ruby Bar, the placer camp 2 full days' hard travel up the grade from Magpie Gulch, smaller and considerably more isolated, supplied only by the same freight road that now sat buried under 4 feet of new snow, with news that settled over Hallie's tent like a stone dropped in still water. Ruby Bar had flour. What it did not have, Pace told her, standing in her doorway with frost still clinging to his coat, was a single grain of anything that would raise it. Pace described it plainly, the way he described most things, but the plainness of it did not make it easy to hear. He had arrived at Ruby Bar 2 days before to find the camp's cook fire, tended by whichever man's turn it happened to be that week, nobody in particular claiming the job because nobody in particular wanted it, and the meal he'd been offered, the same meal he gathered, the camp had been eating twice daily for the better part of 3 weeks, was a flat-scorched cake fried dry in a skillet with no leaven of any kind. Tough enough that one of the older miners joked, without much humor actually behind the joke, that a man could sole his boots with it if the leather ever gave out. The men themselves were not sick, not yet, not in any way a doctor would have named plainly, but they had the particular gray, worn-down look Pace said he recognized from his own trail-driving years, the look of men whose bodies were doing the work of a hard winter on food that gave them calories without giving them very much else, and whose spirits were fraying at the edges in the specific way spirits fray when the one small daily comfort a hard life allows has quietly gone missing and shows no sign of returning. The camp's own cook, an old man named for his trade rather than any family anyone up there could recall, had died of a bad lung the week before Christmas, the same way Josiah Petrie had died at Magpie Gulch the autumn before, and he had taken with him the only living start Ruby Bar had ever possessed, a jar nobody else up there had known enough to tend properly in the 2 weeks since, so that what should have kept working through neglect alone had gone cold and dead in the cold shack where he'd kept it. The camp's supply of saleratus had run out before Christmas as well, and the buttermilk and sour milk needed to work what little remained had never been reliable that far up the grade, even in good weather. 11 men were wintering at Ruby Bar on flour enough to see them through to spring, and nothing whatsoever to turn it into anything but flat, scorched, unleavened cakes, fried dry in bacon grease, meal after meal, with the road down to Magpie Gulch buried under snow that might not clear enough for a loaded wagon for another 6 weeks, if the winter ran ordinary, and considerably longer if it did not. "They're not starving," Pace said carefully, because he was a careful man about exaggeration. "There's flour enough and salt pork and beans, but 11 men eating nothing but flat scorched cakes twice a day for 6 weeks running, in cold like this. with no real bread and no real spirits to speak of either. I've seen camps come apart over less. Man needs something in a winter besides bare survival, or the winter starts to work on him in ways that have nothing to do with his stomach. Hallie sat with that for a long moment, doing the arithmetic she'd been doing constantly since October, only now the numbers on the page were not dollars and cents, but something with considerably more weight behind it. She had, by her own honest count, precisely one living start in the whole of that stretch of the Sierra, sitting in a cracked crock on her own kitchen table, having survived exactly the kind of neglect and cold that had just killed Ruby Bars. She had, too, a debt of $18.20 that stood, as of that second week of January, reduced to $6.40 through 6 weeks of steady bread sales, with the 1st of April still 11 weeks off and every week of continued baking, bringing her that much closer to clearing it in full. Stripping her own trade to send a portion of her start 2 days up a snow-buried grade risked her own production for however long it took to rebuild what she gave away. At exactly the point in the winter when her own counter was busiest and her own debt closest to finally, fully closing. She thought, sitting with the ledger open and the numbers plain in front of her, about Josiah Petrie, a man she had met exactly twice, who had kept a living thing going for 6 years with nobody to teach it to, and nobody, in the end, to pass it on to before he died. She thought about the particular loneliness of that, 6 years of patient, unglamorous work that very nearly vanished from the world entirely for want of one person willing to notice it. She did not think, weighing a portion of her own start against 3 weeks of her own counter's trade, that the arithmetic was especially complicated once she looked at it that plainly. A start given away and tended well multiplied. A start hoarded and never risked stayed exactly what it was, one crock, one counter, one camp, no matter how carefully she guarded it. She thought about it for the length of one evening, no longer, sitting at her table with the ledger open in front of her and Pace waiting, not impatiently, by the door. "How much can you carry and keep it warm the whole 2 days?" she asked. "Enough, if it's packed right, and I keep it close." She portioned out 3 full-quart jars from the healthiest part of her crock that same night, wrapping each one first in wool cloth and then in a second layer with a fist-sized stone she'd warmed at the cook fire tucked in beside it. The same trick, she realized only as she was doing it, that Pace had described old trail cooks using to keep a pouch of starter from freezing against a winter night. She baked through what remained of that evening and the following dawn as well, a full dozen loaves finished and wrapped tight in oiled canvas against the cold, immediate bread that would feed 11 men something real for a handful of days, while the starter she was sending them found its feet in a new camp and a new cook's unfamiliar hands. "You'll want to carry a portion of it against yourself, the way the old ones did," she told Pace, tying the last jar into its wool wrapping. "Not in the wagon bed with the rest, where the cold can reach it easiest. Inside your coat, close to your own body, the whole 2 days. Pace looked at the small, wool-wrapped jar she held out to him, then at her, with something that was not quite a smile, but sat close enough beside one. "Same as they used to," he said, and took it, and tucked it inside his coat against his own chest before he ever swung up onto the wagon seat. The grade itself, Pace told her afterward, ran hardest not in the steepest stretches, which at least kept a team working and warm, but in the long, flat pull along the exposed ridge 2/3 of the way up, where the wind came unbroken across open rock and a man's own breath froze to his collar inside an hour. He'd made that stretch of road perhaps 200 times in 11 years of freighting it, he said, and never once carried anything on it he'd worried about losing to the cold the way he found himself, this particular trip, checking the small wool-wrapped weight against his own chest every mile or so, the way another man might have checked on a sleeping child riding beside him. He left before first light on the 14th of January into cold that Hallie did not let herself think too hard about once he was out of sight up the buried grade, and she spent the 2 days he was gone doing what she had learned over 3 months was the only honest answer to a worry too large to solve by sitting still with it. She tended her own remaining start, baked her own counter's bread, fed her own boarders, and wrote the whole of it into her ledger each evening exactly as it happened, because a true account written down had never once made a hard wait shorter, but it had never once made it harder either. Pace returned on the 16th, 2 days out and back exactly as promised, stamping snow off his boots in her doorway with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd finished a hard job cleanly. He told her the jar against his own chest had come through warm and living the whole way, that Ruby Barr's new cook, a younger man named for nothing more than his own trade as a mule skinner, who had never tended a start in his life but proved, Pace said, a quick enough study once somebody bothered to show him plainly what he was holding. Had it working within a day of the flour and warm water going in, bubbling and rising the same as Hallie's own Crock had back in October. Once she'd finally stopped drowning it in water too hot to let it live. The camp had real bread, however plain and however roughly shaped by a first-time hand, inside of 3 days more, and the dozen loaves Hallie had sent along had carried the gap in between, portioned out carefully enough, Pace said, that even the men who'd been most resigned to a winter of scorched, flat cakes had gone quiet for a moment. That first evening, simply chewing something that tasted like more than bare survival. Word of what she'd done traveled back down that grade faster than the snow allowed a wagon to travel it, carried camp to camp by every freighter who passed through Ruby Barr that winter and heard the story firsthand. The boarding tent woman at Magpie Gulch, who'd bought a dead man's cracked jar for 50 cents and been laughed out of an auction yard for it, had kept the only living bread in that whole stretch of the Sierra through the hardest weeks of a hard winter, and had given a portion of it away freely to 11 men she had never once met the moment she learned they needed it more than her own counter did. The Ruby Barr story did for Hallie's trade what 6 weeks of good bread alone had not quite finished doing. Freighters who passed through Magpie Gulch that February, some of them bound for camps considerably further up the grade than Ruby Barr, began routing their trips deliberately to pass her counter rather than simply passing through camp on the most direct road available, a detour that cost some of them the better part of 2 days out of their way and that they made. Several of them told her without much embarrassment about it, entirely on account of wanting to carry her bread and her starter both back to camps that had heard the story and wanted what Ruby Barr now had. She kept selling loaves at 25 cents and starter at a dime a cupful, and by the middle of February she had begun keeping a second set of figures in her ledger alongside the daily sales, a running tally of just how far that first 50-cent crock had traveled. Starter now tended, by her own count from what freighters told her passing through in no fewer than 5 separate camps beyond Magpie Gulch and Ruby Barr both. Every one of them descended, a spoonful at a time, from the same dried, cracked mass she'd knelt over in a dead man's dooryard the previous October. She walked into Judson Pryor's store on the 9th of March, a full 3 weeks ahead of the 1st of April, and set $6.40 on his counter, the last of the $18.20 she had owed him since the previous winter, paid now in full. Pryor counted it twice, the way he counted every payment, and entered the final sum into his ledger with a small, careful notation beside it. Then he took a fresh sheet of paper, wrote out a short line in his own hand, pressed his store's stamp down against it, and slid it across the counter to her. Account of H. Winslow, paid in full this 9th day of March, 1859. "I'll confess something to you, Mrs. Winslow," Pryor said, setting his pen down, "that I would not have confessed back in October. I extended you that credit expecting at best slow and steady payments through a hard year, and privately doubting even that. I did not, on my honest word, expect to be stamping this account paid 3 weeks early. On the strength of a jar of bread starter, I laughed about myself quietly, more than once, in my own kitchen." "You weren't alone in the laughing, Mr. Pryor," Hallie said. "I heard most of it." "I imagine you did." He almost smiled at that, the closest she had yet seen him come to it. "For what it's worth, I don't imagine you'll hear a great deal more of it going forward. Rance Colvin, whose own counter-trade had thinned further still through the winter, as more of his regular customers found their way to Hallie's window instead, came to her directly in the last week of March. Not with an apology exactly. Hallie understood by then that a man like Colvin rarely offered one outright, but with a plain, practical request that amounted to nearly the same thing. He asked, standing at her counter with his hat in his hands rather than on his head, whether she might sell him a cupful of the start himself, at whatever price she thought fair, because he'd lost enough trade over the winter to see plainly which way the arithmetic of the whole camp had turned. And he'd rather bake real bread himself than keep losing customers to a woman he'd once told, to her face, that he wouldn't take her jar off her hands for free. "A dime, same as everyone else pays," Hallie said, measuring him out a cupful. "I've never charged a different price on account of who was buying." "No," Colvin admitted. "I don't suppose you have." Ambrose Teal, too, found his way back to her counter more than once that spring, not merely for bread, but twice, to ask whether she might spare an opinion on some other overlooked lot at his next estate sale. A request that struck her, the first time he made it, as a strange kind of honor for a man who had once auctioned off her own crock with a joke about resurrected paste. She told him both times, honestly, that she had no particular gift for spotting value in other men's leftover belongings beyond the one crock that had happened, by luck and a half-remembered childhood kitchen, to fall into her own hands. He did not entirely believe her, and said so, but he let the matter drop each time all the same. She sat down with the full winter's ledger on the last evening of March, the night before Pryor's stamped receipt would have come due had she not already cleared it 3 weeks early, and totaled the season the way she'd totaled every hard number since October, honestly, refusing to round anything in her own favor. Better than 400 loaves sold between the 5th of December and the end of March at 25 cents apiece. Past 70 cupfuls of starter sold at a dime each, not counting the 3-quart jars sent to Ruby Bar without charge, or the smaller portions she'd since given freely, on principle now rather than calculation, to any camp cook within reach who asked for one honestly. $18.20 of debt entered as paid in full 3 weeks ahead of its due date. And beyond all of that, once every cost of flour and wood and the 2 failed ovens and the ruined early loaves was subtracted out against every dollar the bread and the starter had brought in, $26 still standing, clear and unclaimed, to her own name. More surplus than Hallie Winslow had held at one time in the whole 14 months since she'd first pitched her boarding tent at the bend of that road. She closed the ledger that night and set it on the shelf beside the crock itself, which still sat, cracked and mended now along its old fault line with a careful binding of wire. Pace had shown her how to work, exactly where it had sat since the first evening she'd carried it home from a dead man's estate sale. By the following autumn, a full year on, from the morning she'd knelt in frozen dirt beside a crock nobody else wanted, Hallie Winslow's boarding tent bore very little resemblance to the canvas and plank structure that had stood at that bend in the road through her first hard winter in Magpie Gulch. The bake oven, rebuilt sound after its one early failure, had been joined that summer by a second, larger dome beside it, built with the same patient, graduated curing Pace had taught her the first time, needed now because a single oven could no longer keep pace with a trade that ran, on an ordinary week, past 60 loaves and a steady handful of starter sales besides. A proper plank building had gone up around the whole operation by August, walls raised where canvas had once simply hung, a real counter facing the road with a wide window cut into it for handing bread through without the whole camp tramping across her floor, and a hand-painted sign above the door that read simply, "Winslow's Bread," the only lettered sign on that entire stretch of freight road. Freighters bound for camps a full 2 days beyond Magpie Gulch had taken, by that second autumn, to timing their whole trip around a stop at her counter, some of them detouring from a more direct road entirely to pass through camp rather than around it, because word had traveled, the way word travels along any road with little else to carry, that Winslow's bread was worth the extra distance in a way little else on that grade was. She kept a girl from a freighting family on to help mornings now, tending the second oven's fires while Hallie shaped and sold, and she had begun that same summer teaching the girl the same careful, patient method Pace had taught her. The slow cure, the graduated fire, the flour tossed across swept stone to judge a heat no thermometer on that road could have measured for her. She remembered of all the ordinary days that made up that second season, one Tuesday in July with more clarity than most, mostly because of who walked up to her window that afternoon. A freighter she did not recognize, driving a team she'd never seen on that road before, who told her, counting out his 25 cents, that he'd come the extra day and a half off his usual route on the strength of a story he'd heard 3 separate times from 3 separate men at 3 separate camps, about a woman who'd bought a dead man's cracked jar for 50 cents, and turned it into the only real bread on that whole stretch of the Sierra. Wanted to see if the story was true, he told her, or if it had grown some in the telling, the way stories do. She'd handed him a warm loaf and told him plainly that if anything the story had shrunk a little, because nobody ever seemed to mention the 60 cents of ruined dough or the day the first oven cracked loud enough to bring her running from 40 yards off. He'd laughed at that, genuinely, and told her he liked the true version better than the one he'd been told, and rode on upgrade with 2 loaves instead of 1. On a clear evening in September, with the light going long and gold across the ridge the way it had the very evening she'd first carried the crock home, Hallie stood in the doorway of her own bakehouse and watched a line of 6 miners waiting patiently at her window for the last batch of the day, freight wagons standing hitched along the road behind them. The whole scene lit warm and amber by the low sun and the glow of the oven's own banked coals through the open door behind her. She had sold, by her own count that week, past 90 loaves in 6 days, and cleared, in the 14 months since she'd first paid 50 cents for a jar nobody wanted, considerably more than she had once believed a boarding tent on that road could earn in a lifetime. She still kept the crock on the shelf above her counter, mended and cracked and entirely unmistakable among the newer, sounder stoneware she'd since bought to hold the starter's daily overflow, because she had decided sometime in that first hard winter that she liked having it where she could see it. It would have been easy enough to retire it, to transfer the living start into something whole and unblemished, and let the old, cracked original sit forgotten in a corner. She never did. She told Willard Pace once, and hardly anyone else, that it seemed a poor way to treat the one thing in Magpie Gulch that had never once, in the whole of that hard winter, let her down. There is something particular about looking back at a beginning once the rest of the story has caught up to it. Hallie had spent 5 months believing, some days more than others, that she might be wrong. That the smell she'd caught kneeling in an auction yard was hope rather than evidence. That a crack running clean through a stoneware crock might run just as clean through whatever plan she'd built around it. She had lost flour to impatience and dough to a collapsing oven, and had stood, more than once, at the losing end of a joke that cost her nothing to ignore, and a great deal, some evenings, to ignore gracefully. What she had never lost, through any of it, was the plain, stubborn conviction that a thing dismissed by an entire dooryard of laughing men was not the same thing as a thing actually worth nothing, that the 2 judgments only looked alike from a distance, and came apart entirely the moment somebody knelt down close enough to smell the difference. She thought some evenings now about Josiah Petrie, an old man she had met exactly twice in her life. Over 2 loaves of bread, she still remembered the taste of 6 years and 1 dead mother later. He had kept a living thing alive in a cracked jar for the better part of 6 years with nobody to teach it to and nobody, in the end, to pass it on to. until a woman with 50 cents and a hard debt and a half-remembered childhood recipe had knelt down in his own dooryard and recognized, in a smell nobody else in that whole camp had bothered to catch, exactly what he'd spent all those years keeping alive. What she had bought that October morning, she had come to believe, was never really a dead man's leftover paste. It was 6 years of somebody else's patient, unglamorous work, waiting quietly for the one person willing to notice it hadn't actually finished. She did not think of herself most days as a woman who had done anything especially remarkable. She had bought a jar nobody wanted, been wrong twice about how carefully it needed handling, cracked an oven through her own impatience, and spent 5 months doing the same small, unglamorous work, morning and evening, that her own mother had once done without any camp of onlookers to laugh at her for it. What had changed, she thought, was not the work itself so much as her own willingness to keep doing it in plain view of people who expected her to quit, and to write every failure down honestly rather than quietly, in the hope that nobody would ever ask to see the page. She kept the ledger open on the counter most evenings still, the same leather-bound book that had once carried nothing but a 50-cent purchase and a debt of $18.20, now running to pages full of loaves and cupfuls and coins counted honestly. Failure sitting beside success in the same plain hand, because she had never once, not through the worst of that first winter, let herself write down only the numbers that flattered her. On the counter beside it most evenings sat a fresh loaf cooling, gold-crusted and cracked open at one end to let the steam escape, and a small stack of coins not yet swept into the tin box she kept for the day's takings, and behind both of them, on its shelf, the same cracked crock, mended along its old fault line, holding within it the same living, working thing it had held since long before Hallie Winslow ever laid eyes on it. Outside, most evenings now, the road past her window carried more traffic than it ever had in her first year at that bend. Freighters, miners, men bound 2 days further upgrade who'd planned their whole trip around a loaf carried out warm from her own oven. She had not set out, that October morning, to become the reason men rearranged a freight schedule. She had only meant to buy a decent skillet with 50 cents and gone home instead with considerably more than she bargained for, which was, she had come to think, very nearly the whole of the lesson worth passing on. If a story about a debt, a dead man's jar, and a whole camp learning to eat real bread again found you tonight, I hope it found you at a good hour. Tap the like button before you go. Subscribe if you'd like another true story of a worthless thing turned into a documented fortune next week. And tell me down in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight, or what you think a woman who can raise the dead out of a cracked jar ought to try her hand at next. Because by every honest line in her own ledger, Hallie Winslow was only just getting started.